Hey everybody, you got Brooks and Elliott from AgriSompo North America. In our first video, we gave you the 30,000 foot view of margin protection. This time we're going to dive down and get into more of the details when it comes to this new product.
Yeah, the first video triggered a lot of questions from everybody, so we want to get into some more of the detail of it with the calculating the key trigger numbers that the margin protection policy identifies.
So, we talked about margin protection, and there's really three primary components. There's yield, there's price, and there's also this new concept of calculating expenses. And what we're going to try to do is bust those out as easy as we can to make those understand. There's a lot of caveats to the program. So again, this is kind of a cursory view of a product we think you may want to take a look at. Let's first take a look at how county yields are expected. Now, Elliott, you always like to remind people this is different than multi-peril in the fact it doesn't protect your yields on your farm. It's county based. Tell us a little bit more about how we get that county yield.
Yeah, so under our margin protection product, you have expected county yields that are derived by RMA, same as they do for area risk plans. Now, the nice thing is that RMA has advanced it where we're actually using farmer reported yields, and they're deriving that to get to the county averages. Also, that is why we have a delay on the final yields because to establish claim, because we're using reported yields from our growers. So again, it's all based off of crop insurance data. In the event RMA has an area where there's not enough production reported, they will make a determination on the expected yield. And then keep in mind that the expected county yield is used for type and practice when you're doing the dollar amount of insurance and liability under margin protection. So you can do standalone, or you can also team it up with an underlying base policy.
So a relatively simple concept. I think everybody understands this from some of the old area risk protection policies that we used to have out there. Very similar to that. The next component is price. Now, when we talk multi-peril, most of us think about projected price and harvest price. And of course, in multi-peril, we tend to look at a spring price, most of the country, the month of February. In the fall, we look at October. Margin protection is a little bit different in how we calculate revenue. Now, Elliott, in the first video, you made sure everybody realized this was not cash price. This is based on futures price, not any different than what we've experienced in crop insurance in the past. Tell us a little bit about how we're going to get those prices in margin protection.
Yeah, what's unique with margin protection is that we're actually getting an earlier projected price discovery period. So versus using what you have in revenue protection, which is, the futures during the month of February, we're actually in the discovery period right now in August, September for corn as an example. So that's how we're going to establish it. Now, the one thing to keep in mind too, if you take margin protection with the harvest price option, you get the greater of the margin protection projected price or the margin projection harvest price. And in 2022, 96% of the margin protection policies did include the harvest price option. And you can see here, we identify the corn and soybeans. You can see the discovery period is between 8/15 and 9/14 for both corn and soybeans. So it gives you an earlier indication of what the projected price is going to be to establish the liability, the expected revenue. And so you can make your decision now because it is a 9/30 sales closing date.
Yeah. The September WASDE report. It's really nice to have that averaging period going on right now, in my opinion. Also, that harvest protection option, we can't really stress enough how important that is. It's going to help you market with more confidence during the year. In the event you get a market that runs higher next year, you've got some protection there. So far, Elliott, we've busted this thing up, and we talked about yield, we talked about prices. I think that's fairly commonplace for most of the viewers because we're so in tune with that in multi-peril. Let's dig into this expense mechanism because it's a little bit different. This is a new concept. And again, giving you the 30,000 foot view, you're going to want to ask more specific questions when you talk to your agent. But let's talk a little bit about these inputs.
Yeah, I think the key thing, we have this slide up here that shows you by commodity, the four commodities that are insured: corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice. And then you can see the discovery periods for the variable expenses. And you'll also note that not all expenses carry across to all crops. So just make sure that the commodity that you're insuring, you're aware, if you have urea, diesel, potash, and of course, interest rates applies to everybody. And there are also fixed costs per crop. Some crops, such as wheat, do have different cost regions. So if you, for example, farm in both the North Dakota side and the Minnesota side, or North Dakota, Montana, you could have two different fixed costs. So make sure you're aware of that, and your agent obviously is the primary person you should speak to as far as your source of information. But you can see how they do establish these pretty early right now to establish that expected costs. And so the variable costs are added to the fixed costs. We subtract that away from our expected revenue, and that's expected margin that you have insured.
Those are all good points. One thing to remember is this is not going to include every single cost on your farm. Like Elliot said, they're grouped into fixed and variable costs, and it's county based. So in our first video, Elliot was very careful to look at your farm and see how you matched up with the county, not just from a yield perspective, but also from an input perspective. That may be an important component that you want to take a look at. Now, I'm gonna break this apart. I don't want to lose anybody's attention. We've just got a few minutes, but let's take diesel for example on here, Elliot. When we look at one of the components that goes into the input segment, diesel is kind of interesting. We've paid tremendously high expenses on fuel over the last year. Tell us how diesel price calculates in here, when that's calculated, where that comes from.
Yeah, well, you can see, we'll just pick on corn again. So you can see we're going to track the futures on diesel from August 15th through the 14th. They're going to use 7.5 gallons per acre as the determination when calculating the expected portion of expense just for diesel within the variable costs. So it sounds all complex, but it's all pretty straightforward. It's what you're already doing on your farming operation as far as expenses. I think the key again with margin protection and margin protection with harvest price option is, do you correlate? Do you have these same expenses on your farm? More than likely you do. So it makes margin protection a very good option for you if again, your yields correlate and your expenses correlate to the larger broad area in the county.
I like it. I think the timing is good on the product. It's not a fit for everyone out there. Before we go, we're going to wrap things up. Let's look at a margin of protection scenario when it comes to corn. And one of the worksheets that you're seeing here is something AgriSompo North America offers. It's interactive. You can look at some different situations. Of course, we don't know where the expenses are going to come in. We don't know where harvest price is going to come in yet, or county yield, but it's good to have some ideas on how things work. Elliot, can you walk us through the basic mechanism on how this might work for an acre of corn, or how someone might get a hold of AgriSompo North America to say, show me the mechanics of this. How does this work?
Yeah, and as we identified in this video and the prior, it's really just all math. It's just that we have more formulas than we used to. But again, the first step is going to be getting your expected revenue, which is going to be the expected county yield times the projected price, and that locks in the expected revenue for the county. Then we're going to take our revenue from step 3, and then we're going to subtract the expected cost. Now, the expected cost is going to be the fixed cost plus the variable cost, and that's going to establish our expected revenue. And then you're going to take your trigger, and to calculate that, you're going to take your expected revenue times your coverage level, and you're going to see what you have to be at from the county to trigger a loss. Now, one of the things we have in there in the calculations for liability is the protection factor. Now, keep in mind, because the protection factor can go as high as 120%, but keep in mind that's also going to increase your liability. So it's not just an increase of the loss payment, it also increases your liability, which will impact the premium calculation as well. So you get your maximum liability established, and then we're going to calculate the harvest margin. So that's going to be your harvest price times the final county yield, again, that RMA has established. Now we have our harvest revenue that we have to consider, And then we have our expenses, because there's a second time where the variable costs are looked at on the trades, the trade board of trades, excuse me. And then we're going to get our harvest margin. And then you just calculate what's the difference, take it times your acres, and you can see in this scenario, we actually had a $7,000 indemnity. Now, one thing to check with your agent is sometimes if you have an underlying base policy, there is an offset as far as indemnity. So your margin protection could be reduced by, for example, a revenue protection indemnity if you would have an individual loss with your base policy. So keep that in mind. But overall, it's pretty straightforward math. And these, as Brooke said, these worksheets are widely available. We distribute them to our agents.
Yeah, sometimes all the components and the busyness of this can be a little scary. It's not when you break it down. There are some great sites